August 15, 1945, 2 hours a.m. 30 feet beneath the scorched earth of Tokyo, Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe's hands trembled as he held the latest intercept reports from Nagasaki. The oil lamps flickered in the underground command center, casting dancing shadows across maps that had once promised victory, but now charted only catastrophe. The air hung thick with the stench of stale sweat and something else, the unmistakable smell of fear seeping from men who had never known defeat. Above them, the distant rumble of B-29 engines vibrated through concrete and earth, a mechanical thunder that had become Tokyo's nightly symphony. Kawabe's eyes met those of General Yoshijiro Umezu across the war room table. Neither man spoke at first. What words could capture the magnitude of their miscalculation? The new reality, Umezu finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of ventilation fans struggling against the bunker's suffocating atmosphere. Kawabe's gaze drifted to the wall-mounted map of Japan, where colored pins marked the positions for Operation Ketsugo, the final homeland defense. Millions of bamboo spears, civilian units, children trained to charge Sherman tanks with explosive vests, against the nation that had split the atom itself. Later, Kawabe would write in his diary, "We who mocked them as soft merchants, what have we awakened? How had they been so wrong?" The answer lay buried in 4 years of willful blindness, rooted in a doctrine that had become gospel in Japanese military academies long before Pearl Harbor. To understand the magnitude of Kawabe's revelation in that bunker, we must return to the fatal assumptions that had guided an empire to ruin. In October 1941, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, General Hideki Tojo had stood before the Imperial Conference and declared with absolute certainty, "The Americans are merchants, not warriors. Their society values comfort over sacrifice, pleasure over discipline. When faced with the steel of Japanese resolve, they will crumble like a house of cards." The assembled military leadership had nodded in unanimous agreement. This wasn't mere rhetoric, it was codified doctrine. Japanese military training manuals from the period described Americans as pleasure-seeking, materialists who measure victory in dollars rather than honor. The belief in Japanese spiritual superiority was so absolute that official military calculations assigned a combat effectiveness ratio of 3-to-1. One Japanese soldier possessed the fighting spirit of 3 Americans. Some field commanders pushed this even further. Captured orders from 1942 stated boldly, "1 Japanese soldier is worth 10 Americans in spiritual power." The concept of Yamato Damashi, the unique Japanese spirit, stood in stark contrast to what they perceived as American weakness. Where Japanese soldiers embraced death before dishonor, Americans supposedly clung to life and luxury. Where Japanese society celebrated sacrifice, American culture worshipped the automobile and the refrigerator. One voice had dared to challenge this consensus. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had lived in America and studied at Harvard, warned his colleagues, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." But his words were dismissed as the overcautious concerns of a man corrupted by too much exposure to Western thinking. The first cracks in this edifice of certainty appeared not in Tokyo's war rooms, but in the blood-soaked coral sand of Guadalcanal. On August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led his elite detachment in a night assault against what he believed would be demoralized, comfort-seeking Marines. The Americans were supposed to break and run at the first sight of Japanese steel. Instead, Ichiki encountered something that shook him to his core. The Marines didn't break. They didn't run. Under the hellish light of star shells and tracers, they stood their ground with a ferocity that defied everything Ichiki had been taught. His elite troops, who had swept through China and Malaya, were cut down by teenagers from Iowa and California who refused to yield an inch of worthless jungle. By dawn, Ichiki's force was annihilated. The colonel himself, unable to reconcile reality with doctrine, burned his regimental colors and walked into the surf to his death. 2 months earlier at Midway, Japanese naval pilots had encountered their own disturbing revelations. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, leading a Zero squadron, watched in disbelief as American Wildcat pilots, flying inferior aircraft, pressed home attacks with suicidal determination. "They refused to break off," he would later report. "Even when burning, even when we had every advantage, they came at us like madmen." His report was filed away, dismissed as combat stress. The evidence mounted. Sergeant Toshio Sakai, writing to his wife from Guadalcanal, abandoned all pretense of superiority. They fight like demons when cornered. We thought them soft, but they are learning our ways and adding their own terrible efficiency. I fear what they are becoming. Even before the war, warning signs had been ignored. Naval attaches in Washington had sent detailed reports about American industrial mobilization, about factories converting from automobiles to tanks in mere weeks. The High Command dismissed these as exaggerations. Impossible claims from officers perhaps compromised by American hospitality. By November 1942, General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, could no longer deny what his subordinates whispered in the darkness. In a private letter to a fellow general, he wrote, "We have gravely miscalculated. The Americans possess not only material strength but a spiritual fury we did not anticipate. They are not the enemy we thought we were fighting." Hyakutake's private fears soon became an avalanche of undeniable evidence that crashed through every level of Japanese command. As American forces began their methodical island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, each battle revealed not just enemy strength, but a terrifying adaptability that shattered the myth of American rigidity. The Japanese had prided themselves on night fighting, considering it their exclusive domain. By early 1943, Marine and Army units were conducting night operations with an efficiency that stunned Japanese commanders. They adapted, they learned, they improved. Worse still, they seemed to relish the challenge. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, the architect of Japan's jungle warfare doctrine, submitted a classified report after observing American operations in New Guinea. "They have become jungle fighters superior to our own. They have taken our methods and enhanced them with their technology and logistics. We are no longer fighting the same enemy we met in the Philippines." The numbers filtering back to Tokyo defied comprehension. Intelligence officers initially refused to believe reports that American shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship every week. When photographic evidence proved it true, they learned the reality was even worse. At peak production, Americans were completing one ship every 42 hours. Japan's entire annual naval production was being exceeded by America every month. But it was Saipan in June 1944 that delivered perhaps the most psychologically devastating revelation. The Americans accepted over 3,000 deaths to take an island that pre-war Japanese doctrine said they would abandon after a few hundred casualties. They didn't just accept these losses, they pushed harder. Marine units that suffered 50% casualties reorganized and attacked again. When Japanese commanders reported this to Tokyo, they were accused of defeatism. The testimonies of returning POWs when they could be obtained painted an even more disturbing picture. American soldiers spoke of their dead with pride, not shame. Families displayed gold stars in their windows as badges of honor. The home front, far from crumbling under casualty lists, was producing B-29 super fortresses at rates that mocked Japan's entire aviation industry. 300 per month by late 1944, while Japan struggled to produce 400 fighters of all types. Admiral Sumu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, finally put into writing what many had begun to think but dared not say. In an eyes-only memo to the Naval General Staff, he wrote, "We face not a decadent democracy but an aroused titan. Our catastrophic miscalculation was not in their material resources, which we knew were vast, but in their will to use them. They have wedded their industrial might to a warrior spirit we claimed they lacked. Each victory costs them dearly, yet they come on with increased fury." By early 1945, the myth of spiritual superiority lay in ruins alongside Japan's defensive perimeter. The soft merchants had become harder than samurai steel, and they were coming for the homeland itself. The warriors were coming, yes, but they rode atop a tsunami of industrial might that rendered Japan's material position hopeless. By 1945, Japanese technical officers were compiling reports that read like suicide notes for an empire. The numbers they contained would have been dismissed as fantasy just 3 years earlier. Consider aircraft production alone. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Japan, straining every resource, managed 70,000. But the disparity went beyond mere numbers. The B-29 Super Fortress program alone cost $3 billion, more than Japan's entire military budget for the war. Each of these aluminum monsters carried computational bombing systems, pressurized crew compartments, and remote-controlled gun turrets that represented technology Japan couldn't hope to match. The Americans hadn't just outproduced Japan. They had technologically leapfrogged into a different era of warfare. Japanese radar operators, when they could detect incoming B-29s at all, worked with equipment that Admiral Takejiro Onishi privately admitted was at least 10 years behind American systems. The proximity fuse, which made American anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective, seemed like dark magic to Japanese pilots who watched their squadrons shredded by shells that exploded at the perfect distance without hitting their target. Perhaps nothing illustrated the gap more starkly than fuel. While Japan desperately tried to produce synthetic oil from pine roots, achieving a pathetic trickle, America's refineries pumped out 6 billion barrels. Japanese pilots trained on gliders to save fuel. American pilots burned thousands of gallons in routine training flights. One captured Japanese technical report noted with despair, "They expend more fuel in a week of training than we possess for a major operation." The logistics chain that supported this mechanical avalanche defied Japanese comprehension. American supply ships carried ice cream makers and movie projectors alongside ammunition. Forward bases that took Japan months to construct were built by Americans in weeks, complete with paved runways, hospitals, and telephone networks. A Japanese engineering officer, examining captured American equipment on Okinawa, wrote, "Each infantry division possesses more vehicles than our entire army in China. Their field kitchens are superior to our permanent facilities." But looming above all these revelations was a secret that would soon transform warfare forever. Intelligence reports spoke of a massive American project involving the nation's finest scientists, billions of dollars, and entire secret cities. The Japanese nuclear physics community, reduced to a handful of researchers working with bicycle parts, could only speculate at what the Americans were building in their hidden laboratories. The soft merchants hadn't just become warriors. They had become gods of war, wielding thunder and lightning on an industrial scale, and they were about to unveil their ultimate creation. The ultimate creation would soon be revealed. But first, the human cost of Japan's miscalculation would be written in the blood and transformed minds of its highest military leaders. These were not statistics or production figures. These were samurai who had staked their honor on Japanese superiority, now forced to confront a terrible truth. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had seen it coming. In the 1920s, he had served as a military attaché in America, driving across the continent, visiting factories, observing the people. Upon returning to Japan, he had warned his colleagues, "The Americans are not what we think. They are pioneers who conquered a wilderness. Beneath their easy smiles lies iron determination." His fellow officers had laughed, calling him the American general behind his back. Now, commanding the doomed garrison on Iwo Jima, he wrote letters to his wife that would never be sent. "The enemy fights with courage that matches our own. Young Marines charge into certain death with the same resolve as our soldiers. We have terribly misjudged them." His final message, transmitted as Americans closed in on his bunker, was stark. "We could not overcome their material superiority and spiritual strength. I take full responsibility." 600 miles away on Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima underwent his own agonizing transformation. He had begun the battle believing in the decisive engagement that would break American will. Week by week, that faith crumbled. In private conversations with his staff, recorded by Colonel Yahara, Ushijima's evolution was painful to witness. "They keep coming. We kill thousands and they mourn their dead, then attack with greater fury. This is not the enemy we were told to expect." His final poem, written before his ritual suicide, abandoned all pretense. "We thought them weak. Steel and spirit combined. Our pride was our doom." Admiral Matomi Ugaki's diary chronicled perhaps the most complete psychological journey. The architect of many Pearl Harbor attack plans, he had begun the war dismissing Americans as bridge-playing Democrats. By 1945, his entries revealed a man haunted by recognition. "The kamikaze strike with divine wind, yet the Americans keep coming. They bury their sailors at sea and steam forward. What manner of enemy is this?" Even the suicide attacks, Japan's ultimate expression of spiritual superiority, failed to break American resolve. His final entry, before climbing into his own kamikaze plane, contained an admission that would have been treason months earlier. We face an enemy superior in both matter and spirit. I die knowing we were wrong. But perhaps no testimony is more revealing than that of Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Okinawa's operations officer, and one of the few senior commanders to survive. In post-war interviews, he described the psychological toll of fighting what he called the learning enemy. Each battle, they studied us. Each tactic we employed, they countered in the next engagement. We were fighting our students who had become our masters. The mental strain of facing an enemy that grew stronger with each encounter while we grew weaker, it broke many officers before American bullets could. These individual transformations, from mockery to respect, from confidence to despair, were multiplied across thousands of Japanese officers. Each represented a personal apocalypse, a samurai's recognition that everything they had believed was false. These personal apocalypses converged into a national reckoning in the summer of 1945. The samurai who had mocked American softness now faced a truth that could no longer be denied. Even at the highest levels of power, the turning point came not as a single moment but as an avalanche of revelations that buried the last vestiges of Japanese delusion. Okinawa had fallen in June after 82 days of hell. The statistics that reached the Supreme War Council were staggering. 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead. But worse, far worse, were the 150,000 Okinawan civilians who had perished. Many by suicide, convinced by propaganda that Americans were demons. Yet intercepted American communications revealed anguished discussions about civilian casualties, medical supplies diverted to treat enemy wounded, and Marines risking their lives to save Japanese children from caves. The demons showed more mercy than the divine empire. In a sealed conference room in Tokyo, the 6 members of the Supreme War Council faced documents that read like Japan's death certificate. Intelligence estimates projected the American invasion force for Operation Downfall: 5 million men, 5,000 ships, 10,000 aircraft. Against this, Japan could muster perhaps 2 million soldiers, many armed with nothing more than sharpened bamboo. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, studying the projections, finally spoke the words that others only thought. The game is up. We face an enemy we cannot defeat, led by men we do not understand, powered by an industry that mocks our every effort. Even General Korichika Anami, the war minister who publicly preached fighting to the last Japanese, privately told his aides, "We have awakened a giant we called soft. Now that giant prepares to crush us with a fist of steel and a heart that accepts any sacrifice for victory. We who spoke of death before dishonor face an enemy who has learned to die as readily as any samurai." But the most terrifying intelligence came from intercepted communications that spoke of a new weapon, something beyond conventional understanding. Japanese physicists, reviewing fragments of American scientific communications, reported to the military leadership with trembling voices, "They have harnessed the power of the sun itself." The deadlock in the Supreme War Council, 3 for surrender, 3 for continued resistance, persisted until Emperor Hirohito himself intervened. The man considered a living god had read the same reports, seen the same projections. On August 9th, as news of Nagasaki's destruction reached the palace, he prepared to speak words that would have been unthinkable when his generals had promised easy victory over soft Americans. The mockery had turned to ash. The certain victory had become certain annihilation. The merchants had revealed themselves as warriors beyond Japan's darkest nightmares. The emperor's intervention shattered more than just military deadlock. It triggered a psychological earthquake that rippled through every level of Japan's command structure. Officers who had spent years preparing to die gloriously now received coded messages that defied everything they believed. The transformation was as rapid as it was profound. Within hours of the Imperial Conference, the machinery of war began grinding in reverse. Secret cables flew to regional commanders with new priorities. Preserve forces, protect civilians, prepare for new circumstances. Commander of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, General Otozo Yamada, stared at his decoded orders in disbelief. Instead of the expected command to fight Soviet forces to the death, he read, "Avoid unnecessary casualties. Preserve order. Await further instructions." His staff officer later testified, "We looked at each other like men waking from a dream or entering a nightmare." The shift exposed the hollow core of what remained. Naval headquarters in Kure reported that kamikaze volunteer rates, once overwhelming, had plummeted to near zero overnight. Young pilots who had written their death poems now tore them up. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze program, found himself abandoned by subordinates who no longer believed in divine winds against an enemy that had split the atom. The psychological collapse was documented in agonizing detail. Colonel Masataka Ida, preparing the defense of Tokyo, wrote in his journal, "The men sense the change like animals before an earthquake. They still salute, still follow orders, but the spirit is gone. We speak of honor while thinking of survival. The Americans have not just defeated us. They have transformed us into something we despise, men who choose life over glory." Across the Pacific, frantic efforts began to hide evidence of war crimes. Officers who had kept meticulous records of prisoner executions and biological experiments now burned documents day and night. The smoke rising from military headquarters wasn't from American bombs, but from Japanese files. They feared American justice more than American bullets. The most telling change came in the suicide preparations among the general staff. Traditional seppuku knives were quietly put away. Officers who had pledged to die rather than surrender now spoke in hushed tones about preserving leadership for reconstruction. General Anami, who would be one of the few to follow through with ritual suicide, bitterly noted, "We prepare to bow to those we called inferior. The greatest defeat is not losing our empire, but losing our conviction." By August 14th, the transformation was complete. Regional commanders reported maintaining discipline not through Bushido, but through promises of American fairness. One message from the Philippines command summed up the new reality. The men no longer fear death. They fear what the Americans might be like. We tell them the enemy is civilized. We who called them barbarians now pray this is true. Their prayers were answered in ways that completed the transformation from mockery to something approaching reverence. When General MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield on August 30, 1945, Japanese officers expected humiliation. Instead, they encountered a conqueror who understood honor, even in defeat. The first meeting between MacArthur and Japanese military leaders set a tone that would reshape everything. Lieutenant General Kawabe, the same man whose hands had trembled in the bunker 2 weeks earlier, was chosen to meet the Supreme Commander. MacArthur's first words weren't of vengeance but of rebuilding. Kawabe later wrote, "I expected a barbarian. I met a samurai in khaki. He spoke of dignity, of Japan's future, of learning from each other. We who had mocked them as merchants discovered they understood honor better than we did." The war crimes trials that followed revealed the depth of transformation. Japanese officers who had once preached racial superiority now testified with brutal honesty about their failures. General Tojo himself, facing the gallows, admitted, "We based our strategy on a fundamental misreading of American character. We saw their love of life as weakness. It was strength. They fought harder to live than we fought to die." The occupation period witnessed extraordinary reversals. Former military leaders didn't just cooperate. They became active advocates for learning from America. Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, who had been ambassador during Pearl Harbor, toured Japan lecturing about American virtues. General Minoru Genda, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, studied American military methods and later helped build Japan's self-defense forces on American principles. Japanese war colleges, rebuilt under occupation guidance, made the study of American military methods mandatory. But more than tactics, they studied the American character that had proved so devastating. Course materials included analyses of American industrial democracy, civilian-military relations, and most importantly, the motivation of free citizens fighting for principles rather than emperor worship. Personal reconciliations provided the most profound transformations. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, meeting Marine veterans of Okinawa, wept openly as he admitted, "You were the better soldiers because you were better men. You fought for life and freedom. We fought for death and slavery disguised as honor." These meetings, repeated thousands of times, built bridges from the ashes of hatred. In his post-war memoir, General Kawabe delivered the final verdict on Japan's fatal miscalculation. "We thought spirit could overcome material. We learned that American material strength came from their spirit, free men building and fighting for something greater than death. We mocked them as merchants. They proved that merchants who fight for freedom become the fiercest warriors of all." The fiercest warriors of all had taught Japan a lesson written in atomic fire and paid for in millions of lives. But from this catastrophe emerged truths that transcend any single war or nation. The whispers of defeated generals in 1945 echo still, warning against the eternal human tendency to mistake our prejudices for prophecy. The danger of cultural superiority, of believing your spirit, your way, your people are inherently better, remains humanity's most seductive and lethal delusion. Japan's military leaders weren't fools. They were intelligent men blinded by their own mythology. They measured American society by its advertisements and movies, not by its foundations. They saw the soft surface and missed the steel beneath, forgetting that the same nation that invented jazz also invented mass production, that the culture that celebrated individual freedom could harness that freedom into collective purpose. Modern military planners study Japan's miscalculation as a cautionary tale. In an age where technology evolves in months rather than years, where industrial capacity can shift with retooled software rather than retooled factories, the penalty for underestimating an opponent has only grown steeper, yet the temptation remains to dismiss others as decadent, to mistake different for inferior, to believe that your own virtues are unique rather than human. The Japanese concept of Hakko Ichiu, 8 corners of the world under one roof, had justified conquest. Transformed by defeat and American magnanimity, it became something else, recognition that all nations could shelter under the roof of mutual respect. The occupation that Japanese officers feared would be vengeful instead became transformative. MacArthur's wisdom, treating defeated enemies as future allies, created bonds stronger than any conquest could forge. Today, American and Japanese forces train together, bound by treaties but more importantly by understanding. The soft merchants and the divine warriors discovered they were both simply human, capable of the same courage, the same cruelty, the same capacity for redemption. In that Tokyo bunker in 1945, General Kawabe had asked what they had awakened. The answer was not just American power, but the possibility of transformation, that from the ashes of absolute war could rise partnership, even friendship. The whispers of humbled generals remind us still, beware the comfort of your assumptions, respect the strength in difference, and remember that today's enemy, approached with wisdom, can become tomorrow's strongest ally.